And it's 7 o'clock. My name is John Moser, professor of history and co-chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. Welcome to our second season if that's the appropriate word, of Documents in Detail, teachingamericanhistory.org's webinar series. In each episode, we'll do a deep dive into a single document, discussing the historical, literary, and rhetorical aspects of it, while also analyzing its impact on American history, the American people, and thought. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is a project of the Ashbrook Center, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based at Ashland University. We provide a variety of programs and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics, all based on primary documents. In the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. To help us begin to think about the topics of this year's webinars, we're drawing speeches, letters, and writings from the Ashbrook Center's extensive document database available at tah.org. You can participate in the discussion by typing your questions into the chat window at the bottom of your screen at any time, and I will do my best to get to all of your questions. The subject of today's program is the Declaration of Independence, and to help discuss it are Dr. Robert M.S. McDonald, Professor of History at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and Dr. Todd Estes, Professor of History at Oakland University. Rob, Todd, it's great to have you with us this evening.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here, John. Thanks for having us.
Well, you're welcome. And just to begin, in 1825, Thomas Jefferson famously wrote that the Declaration of Independence was an expression of the American mind. What did he mean by that?
Todd, you want to go first, or should I?
Why don't you go first and I'll follow?
All right, sure. Well, I think he meant that indeed it was. A little bit of background and a little bit of context. The notion of authorship was becoming much more modern, and the definition of authorship was becoming sort of recognizable to us. So authorship to us, and authorship by 1825, meant that you are the originator of the ideas and the words. And people were beginning to charge Jefferson with plagiarism. And they were beginning to say, hey, check it out. I mean, these phrases sound a lot like John Locke's Second Treatise on Government, or they sound a lot like, what George Mason has produced. And people were beginning to say that, Jefferson was, he had done something wrong. And so he's responding to these charges by saying the Declaration of Independence was never intended to invent new principles. It was never intended to be, an individual expression. Instead, what I was trying to do is distill, all of the ideas that Americans had been discussing and embracing, during the more than 10-year period prior to 1776, that he was trying to put into words, exactly what Americans were thinking and why they objected to British rule.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with everything Rob said, and I think what I would add is maybe a second related point, and that is that what Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, I think very clearly, we know from a lot of other evidence, did represent what large numbers of American patriots were thinking and writing themselves. We know this from a lot of the local declarations that people wrote up and down the seaboard, sent to the Continental Congress, published, circulated privately as well. And when we read those and look at the ideas and the concerns that were developing there, then I think we can see very clearly the ideas that Jefferson articulates brilliantly and famously in the Declaration were, as Jefferson rightly said, not brand new ideas, not novel ideas, not only in the sense of political theory, but also in the sense of what Americans themselves had largely been thinking and writing to each other and writing to their leaders. So I think in that sense, Jefferson meant exactly what he said, in both the authorship sense that Rob talked about, and also in the sense that his words truly did capture the patriot side of the equation in the Revolution.
Maybe we should talk a bit about the historical context of this. The Second Continental Congress has met. What is the occasion for Jefferson drafting this? What are his considerations going in that influence the specific verbiage he uses?
Well, maybe I'll take the first part of that question, and Todd could take the second. Jefferson was well liked as a member of the Continental Congress, in part because of two things. He was quiet in Congress. He didn't occupy a lot of airtime. And he was a really hard worker. He was placed on a number of important committees. And he really distinguished himself as a worker and especially as a writer. The Continental Congress was interested in trying to forge a consensus among different colonies from different regions. The committee that was selected to draft the Declaration included Robert Livingston of New York, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, John Adams of Massachusetts, of course, Ben Franklin, probably the most famous member of Congress at the time, of Pennsylvania. And that left a big hole. They needed someone from the South, and Jefferson, being from Virginia, I think that was an important consideration as well. When it came time for the men to meet, immediately the question came up, well, who's going to take the lead in drafting this thing? Jefferson turned to John Adams and said to John Adams, you should do it. You've been leading the call for independence for months now. And Adams said, no, I can't do it. You must do it. And Jefferson said, well, why me? And Adams said, I'll give you 3 reasons. Reason number 1, I, John Adams, am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular, right? Which is classic John Adams. We gotta love his capacity for self-deprecation. But he was obnoxious in calling for he was obnoxious in calling for independence. I mean, he'd been beating this horse for a really long time. And so he worried that if he was too intimately connected with this document, people might, dismiss it or not take it as seriously. He was suspected too, because remember, he was from Massachusetts, and it was in Massachusetts that the fighting had broken out. It was Massachusetts that had the most skin in this game. It was in Massachusetts that blood had been shed. It was Massachusetts that had been targeted by the Intolerable Acts, which followed the Boston Tea Party. Jefferson could be a little bit more impartial as a Virginian, and that would give him greater credibility. Adams said, reason number 2, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to be at the head of this business. Again, for the reasons that he had spelled out. New England was on board this project of independence, but bringing in the South, the Southern delegates at the Continental Congress was very important. And then Adams said, reason number 3, a big compliment coming from John Adams. Adams said, you, Thomas Jefferson, can write 10 times better than I can.
So the musical 1776 basically got it right.
It basically did.
Yeah.
That's right.
Todd?
I was gonna say, this should be a musical almost, and of course it already is. And Rob and I have known this for a long, long time. Just a couple of things I think to add to that. I think something else that makes Jefferson's authorship really key here in the context of the Continental Congress is that whereas Adams was acerbic and obnoxious and disliked by many people, he tends to write that way, I think, as well. But Jefferson, not only in this letter, but in so much else that Jefferson writes, I mean, he obviously could write in anger, as he did sometimes, but the Declaration is, I think, emotionally a very cool, calm, restrained kind of performance, kind of document. And I think Jefferson was very, very good at that. I mean, Adams and Jefferson were both great writers, but they were, as Rob notes, I think, different writers. And I think the tone and the style and the approach and the manner of Jefferson was really perfectly suited to this document. I think the other thing as well, the second point I would make, comparing the two, and I think this is something that the Congress valued in Jefferson, he could be admirably succinct. He could get to a point, he could make it, he could develop it to the point that he needed to, and then he would get out and move on. Adams, I think, rather always was long-winded. Adams was far more like Alexander Hamilton in that he tended to overwrite. If 6 pages would do, he'd write 12. And I think in this case, Jefferson is able to express this not only eloquently and succinctly, but also do it in a way that's in which both the tone and I guess the length and the style really dovetailed very nicely. That's a great skill to have, and I think members in Congress recognized that in Jefferson, and that's one of the reasons why his authorship, I think, was critical. I would argue to the success of the document, that it was Jefferson as the primary author, even if he is expressing this American mind, rather than Adams as the primary author. They could both summarize, but I think they did it in very different ways, and I would argue Jefferson's was more effective.
This is a great opportunity for our first question from our participants. Stacy Moses asks, was there any evidence that Jefferson actually knew about or read some of these other private or state level writings pertaining to, well, we're not talking about Locke, obviously he read Locke, but some of these other things that could have been regarded as expressions of the American mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the documents that he was accused of plagiarizing, by some uncharitable people in the 19th century were documents that were well known. They were well known to everybody. They helped to shape the American mind. They were expressions of the American mind. I'm thinking of not only Locke's second treatise, but Sam Adams's Rights of the Colonists as Men, which came out, I believe, in 1765 in response to the Stamp Act. He uses the expression life, liberty, and property. George Mason, in his Virginia Declaration of Rights, uses language that's similar. I mean, it's essentially everywhere. And I think that's part of what Jefferson is up to. As Todd pointed out so well, Jefferson was a great writer. And in many respects, I think in our parlance, what Jefferson was doing was he was essentially inserting into the text of the Declaration 18th century hyperlinks, right? So when you saw life and liberty, and then he changes it to the pursuit of happiness, which we can discuss later if you wish, that was a hyperlink. Everyone knew that connected to John Locke. Everyone knew exactly what he was talking about. So in a way, he's referencing these other documents. He's almost like he's a musician and he's sampling, different music.
Todd, do you have something else to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say briefly, yeah, I think in terms of these local declarations, I think a great number of those were actually intentionally sent to the Continental Congress as a way of, again, hearing from their constituents. That idea of corresponding between the colonies and corresponding with different bodies had been developed earlier in the revolutionary struggle. And I think this is one of the ways that Jefferson and the Continental Congress could be assured that they were not too far out in front of their people, not too far out in front of the people they were representing, because these local documents were being sent in and they could be read and seen, I think less for particular phrases or ideas that people might borrow, but simply as a sense of where, if you will, public opinion could be measured in the absence of other kinds of gauges that we know of, like polling and things like that, to try to gauge public opinion. So I think these were sent to Congress, and they would, not only Jefferson, but all the delegates there would have had quite a sampling of opinion from around the country and would kind of know, again, where they were and where their constituents were.
Well, this gets me to my next question. What exactly was Jefferson and Adams and the rest, what did they hope to accomplish through this declaration? They mentioned, of course, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. But did they have specific goals in mind aside from simply announcing independence?
I always jump in because the silence makes me uncomfortable, but I don't always want to be the person who responds first. So Todd, why don't you take a swipe at this and then I'll chime in.
Oh, sure, yeah. I thought we were in a 1-2 pattern there, but that's fine. We'll shake things up and vary here. Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on how you want to read this document. If you want to read it as sort of a general statement of principles and ideas into which the Continental Congress is attaching the American situation, or if you want to read it sort of from the outside in as a very particular document that speaks to the American principles that then tags on these other kinds of ideas and principles that, of course, later were famously picked up by by many, many others and still have a great resonance today. So I think some of that depends on this inevitable question we can ask about every document, and that is, who is the audience? What is the audience? And I think in this case, the Declaration probably has multiple audiences. I think for one, it's sort of reflecting back to the American people some of the same sentiments they've been reaching on their own independently for the past several years. It clearly declares to a candid world, as Jefferson writes, and to the British, what the colonies are doing, that they are now declaring themselves the United States of America, and all the efforts at reconciliation that have been tried and failed and found wanting are now being abandoned. And this is a new day and a new beginning here. So I think in that sense, they're declaring this for, and I guess the third sense I would add is they're declaring it obviously for posterity. They clearly, the founding generation had a tremendous interest in and dedication to the theme and to trying to know that their goals, their deeds, the work that they did would be talked about in later generations, would be revered, would be acted upon and followed in later generations. And so I think they're also part of their audience is sort of across and through time here as well. So I think that's what I would say. And then Rob, I'm sure, can pick up on other points.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Todd says is spot on. Your question calls to mind, the words of John Adams in 1776. He estimated that you could almost divide the American population into thirds. A third of the people were in favor of independence, a third of the people were opposed to independence, and a third of the people were on the fence. And I think it's probably a good rough estimate that he made. Certainly, those were the three options that were available to people. And since you very much care about having a government that derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, not only is the Declaration trying to express the American mind, but certainly the Declaration is trying to shape the American mind and to lay out in a very clear, compelling way exactly what the purpose of government was and why the British government was no longer serving that purpose, and how this was not because of light and transient causes, but only because of repeated injuries and usurpations that the colonists had tried to address with petitions. They had complained, they had spoken out, and time after time again, the British government had violated their rights.
Okay, well, I eventually want to get to the question of how this document was received, but maybe we should spend some time talking about how it was crafted. And of course, this requires us to look at the original draft and compare it to the final one. Larry Fata has a question specifically on this. Larry writes, "I've always been fascinated by Jefferson including the abolition of slavery in his original draft, especially in light of his continued ownership of slaves. Also, he included a complaint that the British were inciting rebellions among the slaves, which seems contradictory. Can you comment?"
Well, sure. I mean, I think that first of all, I mean, it's very interesting that Thomas Jefferson blames the slave trade upon the king. And he views this as absolute barbarism, that people in their native land would be kidnapped and captured and carried off in chains and brought against their will to the New World is, clearly repugnant to him. And that is clearly wrong as far as he's concerned. And in fact, as far as Jefferson's record on slavery, one of his greatest achievements is at the earliest constitutionally allowable moment, which was 1808, Jefferson was president, he signed into law a bill that ended the international slave trade. And I think that was possible politically, not only because of anti-slavery sentiment in the North, but also, frankly, because politically powerful, large Southern planters would essentially be able to use the end of the international slave trade to increase the value of their own slaves and make it more difficult and more expensive for startup planters to acquire slave labor. So, that's true. And Jefferson was very much against the slave trade. But of course, he's also fearful of slave uprisings. There had been slave uprisings already in American history, and there would be more to come. And that is something that slaveholders, feared continually. And one of the things that Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, did was he promised slaves who were enslaved by patriot masters, if you can slip away and find the British Army, we will take you in and allow you to fight for us and work for us during the course of the war. And the promise was, after the end of the war, you'll be given your freedom. That promise usually wasn't kept, but it's a promise that was made. So it was very destabilizing.
Okay.
I think the other thing I would add to that is that including slavery in this really, I think, sort of muddies the focus in a way that, because obviously the colonists were clearly not blameless in that. And although Jefferson wants to point the finger at the king and British commerce and things, obviously he knew, as the others knew, that the colonists were deeply implicated in that. And I think if you're trying to craft a document, as this is, a document that's aimed at the king and his ministers and what the British have done for the past decade, to bring in the slavery issue really sort of muddies it a little bit and blurs that focus, because it's hard to keep the focus purely on the king and purely on the British. And I think this is one of those changes where I think the Jefferson's friends in the committee who revised this did a good job. I think it made it even more succinct. We talked before about how Jefferson could be very pithy and very much to the point in his writing. I think the revisions made to Jefferson's original draft made that even more so. They sort of underscored Jefferson's best points. And I think leaving that part out, cutting that part as they did, really made it a much tighter and more tightly argued document. And I think that added to its power and success and persuasiveness.
Yeah, right. And, other alterations were made, by Congress as a whole. And when the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, heard of this, they essentially made it known, if this stays in, you could count us out. So it's really kind of poignant when you think about it. I mean, at the very moment of America's birth, slavery possessed the potential to lead to a dissolution of the Union. And at the moment of America's birth, we compromise on the issue of slavery.
Well, this is where Edward Rutledge sings "Molasses to Rum to Slaves," right?
That's right. Great song.
I have to say, 15 years ago, I was in 1776. I played Josiah Bartlett of
New Hampshire, right?
New Hampshire, yeah. And so my great line was, "For the love of God, Mr. Rutledge, please." I do want to get to some of the other changes that you see going from the rough draft to the final draft of the Declaration. But a very interesting question is being asked by Nick S. I keep hearing America/American. He wants to know, and so do I, when it became common for residents or leaders of Britain's North American colonies to refer to themselves as Americans.
Well, I think partly we can get at the answer to that by thinking about the context of 1776 and sort of the other great document published earlier that year in January, which was, of course, Paine's Common Sense, which refers repeatedly to the idea of American this, American that. And I don't know that was new and original with Paine, certainly. And I know in many ways, thinking about America as a place actually began, I think, with at least as early as the Grenville ministry in the mid-1760s in Great Britain, when they're trying to figure out what to do about these colonies, what to do at the end of the Great War for Empire. They're the ones actually on the other side of the Atlantic that begin to think about and sort of identify America as a place, even before the British colonists in America do themselves. So I think in many ways that the idea of America and American would be clearly in people's mindsets because of Paine and Common Sense, which of course was enormously widely published, widely read. People would have heard it as well as encountered it in print, and that would sort of be in the mindset in the American public by the time that the Declaration is printed a half year later.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the need for the word American is apparent in this situation. I mean, in the run-up to the Declaration of Independence, it was well enough for them to refer to themselves as Englishmen, and to refer to the rights of British individuals. But they're very explicitly making the point that they're not, right? And that they are also one people, and that they are connected by their residence here on this continent, their shared language, their shared culture, their shared values, and maybe most especially their shared principles.
Okay. One of the other passages that doesn't find its way into the final document is, let's see, it starts with, we have reminded them, this is where he talks about our British brethren toward the end. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. That found its way into the final. Followed by this, no one of which could warrant so strange a pretension that these were effected at the expense of our own blood and treasure, unassisted by the wealth or the strength of Great Britain, that in constituting indeed our several forms of government we had adopted one common king, thereby laying a foundation for perpetual league and amity with them, but that submission to their parliament was no part of our constitution, nor ever in idea, if history may be credited. Oh, this is kind of a fascinating passage. On the one hand, unassisted by the wealth or the strength of Great Britain, is Jefferson seriously claiming that Great Britain had nothing to do with the thriving of the states, especially during the recent French and Indian War?
Well, I mean, you're maybe raising an issue about why it was removed. I think what Jefferson is doing here, though, is he's channeling his 1774 pamphlet, The Summary View of the Rights of British America. And there he sort of lays out his perhaps idiosyncratic version of American history, where he points out that the original settlers of these colonies were not agents of the British government. They were not funded by the British government. It's not like, the moon landing in 1969, where the American taxpayer paid for Neil Armstrong to set foot on the moon. These were private individuals. They were funded by joint stock companies, or they paid, their way across out of pocket. And he said, for themselves they settled, for themselves they struggled, for themselves they alone had the right to hold. And he says that they voluntarily gave their allegiance in this state of nature which they discovered, right? They voluntarily gave their allegiance to the King of Great Britain, and therefore they could voluntarily withdraw that allegiance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think Jefferson clearly certainly knows better, knows that the British had an enormous amount to contribute, certainly to the growth and the rise of the colonies. But again, the purpose of this document is not to sort of be the subtle scholar, right? Not to sort of say, well, there's 17 points on this side and 14 points on that side, and 6 of these have great merit and 3 have some merit and things like that. I sort of always think of him as writing this in almost a fever of concentration, where he's writing, he's got a point he wants to make, and every single thing that he's trying to do has got to essentially do the work of excoriating the British for everything. I mean, this is sort of a classic breakup letter, right? Where he's sort of saying here, you've never loved us, you don't love us now, let's quit pretending like you ever have. And I think Jefferson, in including that part in his draft, I think is trying to connect and say, well, we've never needed you, we don't need you now. We've really never needed you, because when you really think about it, there's nothing fundamental that you've done to really help us. It's clearly a bit of an exaggeration, but I think it's true to the sentiment that Jefferson is writing within, the sort of framework that he's writing within, and it's true to his sense of controlled anger that he's sort of expressing and I think channeling in the Declaration.
And I'll just add really quickly too. I mean, I think a lot of times we hear people. I remember my high school social studies teacher describing the American Revolution and our Declaration of Independence as sort of like a parent-child situation. I'm pretty sure that Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and all the rest would strongly object to that metaphor. They were adults. America had been settled and peopled and colonized by adults, and they were, claiming their fair place.
I hope all of you are paying attention to that. Now, the eminent scholar, Robert McDonald, he may disagree with what his high school history teacher said, but he remembers it. So take note. I want to look at another passage that didn't make it past the proverbial cutting room floor, and it's just a little bit past the one we're just talking about. This is again where we've appealed to our British brethren, but they too have been deaf to the voice and justice of justice and of consanguinity. That part made it in. And when occasions have been given them by the regular course of their laws, of removing from their councils and disturbers of our harmony, they have by their free election reestablished them in power. At this very time, too, they are permitting their chief magistrate to send over not only soldiers of our common blood, but Scotch and foreign mercenaries to invade and destroy us. These facts have given the last stab to agonizing affection, and manly spirit bids us to renounce forever these unfeeling brethren. We must endeavor to forget our former love for them and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We might have been a free and a great people together, but a communication of grandeur and of freedom, it seems, is below their dignity. Be it so, since they will have it. The road to happiness and to glory is open to us too. We will tread it apart from them. It's a very interesting passage. Kind of lovely as well. Why does that not make it into the final draft?
Well, I agree. I think it is a beautiful passage. I really like that. I think it's very nicely expressed, and it's a very poignant, I think, really fervently written passage. But again, it seems to be again broadening the focus. If the real goal here is to indict the king for his many crimes against his colonists in North America, this seems to be broadening it even to perhaps the British electorate, those people who are sending members to Parliament, who are continuing to pass these laws and these measures, who are continuing to send troops to the British colonies and to the people in the government who have been chosen and are continuing to do this as well. So it really sort of broadens that focus in a way that tends to distract and sort of drive off the course a little bit. I can see why Jefferson loved this so much, because it is a great passage, but I think it was sort of rightly cut if we're thinking about the Declaration again as being a document with a purpose. And I think this goes a little bit off a wonderful detour, but nonetheless, I read it as a kind of detour, and that blurs the focus of his charge.
Yeah, I think Todd's exactly right. I think what is behind this sentiment fundamentally is a sense that the British have declared independence from us through their actions, right? Yeah. That they have abandoned their government of us. That a government, a just and legitimate government, protects rights to life and liberty and property. They've been injuring those rights, and in the process of doing that, they had started not to treat the American colonists as fellow Englishmen, but frankly, they had started to treat American colonists like Irishmen, right, as a foreign people who could be occupied and invaded, and at the point of a musket or a bayonet, be coerced into obeying and acquiescing to British law. That's not how you treat a free people.
Now, but doesn't this get us to one of the main problems with the Declaration of Independence, that George III is made out to be some sort of absolutist tyrant, when in effect he rules with the consent of Parliament, and Parliament is getting off pretty much scot-free in this document, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, just go back to that same passage there. Jefferson's most poignant phrase to me is when he talks about how, we could have been great together. We could have been so good. And I think from 1763 onward, the British colonists in North America thought it was great and couldn't quite figure out why the British kept changing policies and doing these things. And the real mover behind those policies was, of course, always, Parliament and the various prime ministers. So I think, again, rather than going after Parliament separately or differently or in relation to the king. I think the major thing is it's good to have sort of maybe one clear enemy you can go after rather than multiple. But I think, again, everything they say about the king, it seems to me could fairly be applied to Parliament. And certainly as the colonists made their declarations here of charges of betrayal as they saw it, I think Parliament's right up there with it.
But the scathing criticisms of Parliament are blunted before it goes to the final version, and the final version really is a broadside against the king. Could this be because people, the members of the Continental Congress, recognize that they have friends in Parliament, and so they don't want to offend Parliament needlessly? They think that maybe at one point. In one point, Parliament might decide that they don't want to vote further war funds?
That's a really interesting possibility. I'd never considered it before, John. I think it may well be true. I think probably the primary reason why the blame is laid squarely at the feet of the king is because, first of all, as king, he does assent to all the laws of Parliament. And this is, after all, not yet another petition. This is a declaration of independence, and the king is the head of state. So to separate from the British state, they need to make the king out to be the person who is ultimately responsible for all of these offenses.
Okay, I want to remind those of you who are listening, if you have questions to add, we currently welcome them. Maybe now we should spend a little time on the reaction to the Declaration of Independence, and this would bring us to Thomas Hutchinson. Now, not a lot of Americans are familiar with the Loyalist argument, and I have to say, upon reading this, it seems kind of strong. Is Hutchinson right in at least some ways in his scathing denunciation of this document?
Well, I think Hutchinson is clearly one of the sharpest, most articulate of the group of people we think of as loyalists, and he has certainly struggled with not only rowdy crowds in Boston, but with pamphleteers and those in the Patriot organization for some time. And I think it's interesting when we read these strictures, as he calls them, where he goes clause by clause and simply tears apart what's been written here. But I think part of what gives us a sense of his mindset, where Hutchinson is coming from, comes in the sort of introductory part of this document, where he talks about how many thousands of people who were before good and loyal subjects have been deluded and by degrees induced to rebel against the best of princes and the mildest of governments. I think for Hutchinson and many loyalists, that was exactly true. King George was a very benevolent king, very mild. It was a very mild government. And what happened was a few rowdies and hotheads were basically stirring the pot. And they did this enough times and provoked enough incidents to where they gradually diluted the colonists. And that, to me, I think, is a very important aspect of the loyalist reaction to not just the Declaration, but the loyalist reaction to the entire colonial protests going back to 1765. You people don't know how good you have it.
A king who was, in fact, much beloved in Great Britain, and certainly would be during the Napoleonic Wars. Rob?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, again, Todd has made a really shrewd point there. I also zeroed in on a statement made by Hutchinson at the beginning of the document, which is essentially that, you know what, there are some of these hotheads, they had wanted independence all along, right? Ever since the Stamp Act. It was just an excuse for them to make a case for independence. And the fact that he believed that, and I believe that he believed that very sincerely, I think maybe helps us to understand just how the situation spun out of control. In 1765, guys like James Otis and Sam Adams, claiming that the Stamp Act was evidence that the British wanted to enslave them and take away their rights. There were probably a good number of Americans who thought that they were really out to lunch. And yet, when you consider the British reactions to American actions, such as sending troops to live among them without their consent, such as using those troops to march out through Lexington, to Concord, to take their weapons. These people who might have been regarded or disregarded as conspiracy theorists in 1765 were prophets by 1775 because of the actions of the British.
Okay. Why don't we look at one of these passages here? I would tell you what page it's on mine, but everyone who's printed it probably has a different pagination. This is part of the preamble, if that's the appropriate thing to call it. I should therefore be impertinent because he's going to be puckish here, if I attempted to shew in what case a whole people may be justified in rising up in oppugnation. Oppugnation? I don't know that. There are a few words that he drops in here that I never heard before. In oppugnation, which I assume means opposition, to the powers of government, altering or abolishing them, and substituting in whole or in part new powers in their stead. Or in what sense all men are created equal, or how far life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness may be said to be unalienable. By the way, I have to remember to mention why he goes from using liberty, it's why he goes from property to pursuit of happiness, may be said to be unalienable. Only I could wish to ask the delegates of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas how their constituents justified the depriving more than 100,000 Africans of their rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and in some degree to their lives, if these rights are so absolutely unalienable. Doesn't he have a pretty significant point here, or a series of significant points?
He does, and it's one that was not lost on the leaders of the independence movement. Back in the 1760s, in response to British actions, John Adams himself said, "We won't be their Negroes." Direct quote, "We won't be their Negroes." In other words, we will not allow them to treat us as badly as we treat the people we hold in slavery.
Yeah, Rob's absolutely right. And I think, again, that's why the constant use by Jefferson and by many other of these colonial protests of the phrase slavery and enslavement keeps coming up. And they don't mean chattel slavery, but they mean being treated in the sense of the way that the colonists treated their slaves as well, which of course was chattel slavery. So I think that's that concept, that idea of slavery in this revolutionary time period does cut a couple different ways. And I think Hutchinson, as earlier and later critics, skewered the independence movement, the Patriot movement did not have a clean record on this. And I think Hutchinson does raise points there, certainly, that are obviously worth thinking about. And to Hutchinson and many loyalists, that absence of that consideration, I think, really undercut that larger argument. How can you talk about unalienable rights? How can you phrase this the way you do and talk about life and liberty, and yet for people from Maryland South continue to own and buy and sell slaves in that way? I think it is a telling point, and it's part of that Hutchinson's contempt, I think, for the arguments and dismissal of any sort of notion that there's some higher principle that they're really fighting for here.
And yet, we know there's a great book that was published in 1975 that I know Todd and John have read, and perhaps even the people who are listening into the conversation, by Edmund Morgan, called American Slavery, American Freedom. And the subtitle is The Ordeal of Colonial Virginia. But one of the questions he's asking is exactly the one that Hutchinson poses. How is it that these people surrounded by slavery would speak so eloquently and loudly about liberty? And the answer for him is it was the fact that they were surrounded by slavery, that they saw every day people who were unfree, people who who didn't forget having a right to property. They didn't even own themselves. It made freedom that much more how can I put it, essential to them, right? They understood what slavery really was, and that deepened their appreciation for freedom and their insistence that they would maintain it for themselves.
I have some more questions about Hutchinson, but I don't want to go too much farther without addressing the question of how Locke's concept of life, liberty, and property morphed into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Could you say a little about that?
Well, John, I know what one of the things that you were going to say, because you said the word unalienable. And when we think about what unalienable means, an unalienable right is one that cannot be assigned to someone else. And a life is unalienable, liberty is unalienable, but property is alienable. You can sell your house to someone else. You can transfer your property rights. So from a sort of philosophical standpoint, that's not a very good fit. I think there's another factor that should probably be considered. There was a great book that came out, I think in 1992, by the late great Stanford scholar J. Fliegelman, called Declaring Independence. And essentially, he made a kind of neat and startling discovery. Among the original broadsides, the printed versions of the Declaration of Independence, is one that's really peculiar because it has scattered within the text all of these strange punctuation marks, quotations, and apostrophes. And why that was always sort of a mystery. Fliegelman found in Jefferson's library a book on rhetoric that said essentially that good writing is compelling when it's read aloud, that it has certain natural rhythms, that you should emphasize words, that you should have a certain sort of cadence, and that you should keep track of the rhythm and the parts where you emphasize things by using a system of symbols. And the system of symbols suggested in this book correspond to these errant punctuation marks in this broadside. So it seems as if Jefferson supplied this draft of the Declaration that was marked up in this way to that printer, and that printer just literally transcribed them. In other words, I think one reason that Jefferson wrote Pursuit of Happiness instead of Property is because it just flowed better.
That's fascinating to me, because I had heard the argument that that property is alienable, therefore we don't include it. And it's always bothered me because, of course, property is alienable, but our right to property is not, right? I mean, we all, in the abstract, have the right to own property, whether or not we actually own it. But yeah, that's very interesting. Todd, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Rob's great point that sort of comes from Fliegelman, has been developed by some other scholars as well about this. I just was rereading. I'm teaching this book this semester in a few weeks when I get started. The new book by Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onuf, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, which is a study of Jefferson's, not a biography, but a study of Jefferson and several themes. And there's a great chapter there on Jefferson and music. I mean, Jefferson is a player and singer himself, but it ends with a very thoughtful meditation on the Declaration of Independence as a piece of music. And they make a pretty compelling, to my mind, pretty compelling argument that Jefferson thought about the Declaration as something to be performed, that not only with the marks and the punctuation and things like that, but the flow of the line, the fact that Pursuit of Happiness sounds better than property when you say it and attach it as the third part of that statement. And his constant reference to things like, harmonizing principles or harmonizing tendencies, talking about American voices and things like that. They make a pretty compelling case that Jefferson, like a composer, would put marks in this piece of writing to indicate how it should be performed, in the same way that composers mark music with pianissimo or sforzando or retards or things like that, that it's a set of stage directions, because Jefferson expected, and I think believed, that the Declaration would be more effective read aloud. And that's another thing that the Declaration has in common with Paine's Common Sense, which was widely reprinted, but was also a document meant to be read and therefore heard, because Paine spent hours working with Benjamin Rush, reading this aloud and changing various phrases and things like that, in the same way that I think Jefferson, I don't know, Rob probably does because he knows far more about this, but I'm not sure if Jefferson read this or practiced on someone in the way Paine did, But I think Jefferson, just in his mind's ear, if you will, read this aloud, talked about it himself, and clearly thought this was something that needed to be performed. And so I think what Fliegelman did, and the way that, for example, Gordon Reed and Onuf have now worked that into a larger part of Jefferson's understanding of music, is just really fascinating, and I think spot on.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting question from Debbie Price. She notes there are several references to God. Now, divine providence, laws of nature and nature's God, supreme judge of the world. Were these intentionally used for purposes of convincing people to back the Declaration, or was it something they actually believed? This puts me in mind of a comment that in the run-up to the 2012 election, when Mike Huckabee was still in the running, he said something to the effect of most of the signers of the Declaration were clergy. He was roundly criticized for that because, of course, they weren't. But this feeds into Debbie's question. Were the signers overtly religious in the way we think of it today? And when they use terms that seem to seem to refer to God, are they doing this because they look good or because they actually believe that?
Rob, you should go ahead and take this first.
Okay, sure. I mean, the first point I'll make is, I'm sure, one that Todd would make, that there was a great deal of religious diversity among the members of the Continental Congress, both in terms of the the specific churches they attended. There was a Catholic among them. There were members of the Church of England. There was a Quaker, but also in terms of their kind of fundamental beliefs. There were people who, in our parlance, I guess we would call kind of like born again Christians or evangelicals, and there were others who were more like deists. And Jefferson was a deist. Jefferson believed in God. But he didn't believe in a God who intervened in the workings of the world. The common analogy is the divine clockmaker or watchmaker, who created this amazing machine and created the laws of physics and imparted into humanity a sort of moral sense and a benevolence. But because God was perfect, he didn't have to go back and intervene and flood the earth, or even send his son to live among us. So that's sort of the range, and yet I think they did, to a person, believe in God, and I think that they understood their audience, and that this would make it more compelling as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think the answer to the question is probably not either or, but both. I mean, I think they did genuinely believe this in many cases. Some more than others, but I think it's also part of a general knowledge of their audience, knowledge of what their audience would have believed and would have known themselves. And again, it's a way, I think, of sort of speaking in fairly general terms about this divine presence or divine being in the various ways that they refer to it there. So I think it is an expression that many people would take very seriously themselves, but I think it's also the sort of thing that can work at a broader, less specific and far more general level to do some important sort of rhetorical work in this document.
The reference to divine providence was particularly interesting to me because recently I read a letter from Jefferson where he described himself as an Epicurean. Now, for those of you not familiar with Epicureanism, this was a pre-Christian sort of a philosophy that came out of the Hellenistic world, in which there are all sorts of references to divine providence, not to refer to a particular God, but to some deity who is in charge. And the Epicureans believed that this is an essentially benign force, that things essentially work because divine providence is in effect. So yeah, when I saw the term divine providence, I immediately thought of Jefferson's reference to himself as an Epicurean, and perhaps most deists would have had a similar view. Got another question here, and this is I guess in the short time that we have left, I want to talk a little bit more about the reaction to this document. Is this a successful document? I mean, Cody Northrup puts it like this. When did the Declaration come to be recognized as the expression of the American mind, in Jefferson's words? In other words, when did it begin to receive the esteem that it holds today as the seminal American document? I mean, is this simply a case that because we happen to win the American Revolution, now we look back at this document as being critically important, or was it regarded as such in the 1770s?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, let me answer briefly and then turn this over to Rob, who's actually published quite a bit on this and will have a lot to share with us. But I think one theme I would just bring up quickly is that in some ways the Declaration sort of gets, if not rediscovered, at least brought back to the surface quite a bit during the party conflicts of the 1790s, when Jefferson and the people who would become Democratic Republicans with him, like Madison and others, were deeply troubled by the Federalist celebrations of George Washington and Washington's birthday, which was February 22nd. And they very consciously wanted to make the great national holiday not Washington's birthday, but the birthday of the nation, July 4th. And of course, they coined that phrase, principles and not men. And so in some ways, the Declaration begins to come back to life and have a real impact in the 1790s as a kind of rallying point for many Democratic Republicans against the Federalists. And then, of course, from that point on, once Jefferson comes into power and the Democratic Republicans become the dominant power across the country, then it does get reified into the kind of document that looks something like we think of it today. But then, of course, there's a later development in the 1860s that Rob can talk about that helps further that cause as well.
Yeah, so I think Todd is exactly right. It's probably worth noting that Washington ordered that the Declaration be read in front of the Army. It was proclaimed publicly, read aloud, just as intended, throughout the United States. The text of it appeared in nearly every Patriot American newspaper, so it was hardly ignored. People understood that it was a big deal, but they treated it maybe more like a press release than the Declaration of Independence, this great national statement of purpose. And as Todd pointed out, it was really kind of a gradual process that the Declaration of Independence came to be recognized as a big deal. And part of that process is linked to Jefferson's initial lack of fame as its author, and then growing fame as its author. The first public reference that I could find to Jefferson as the author of the Declaration of Independence was in an Independence Day sermon delivered by the president of Yale at the time, Ezra Stiles. And Stiles preached that it was Thomas Jefferson who poured the soul of the continent into the monumental Declaration of Independence. And it's interesting to see how Stiles discovered that it was Jefferson, because in his diary, he writes earlier that year in 1783 that he dined in company with Colonel Langston of New Hampshire. He says Mr. Jeffreys of Virginia wrote the Declaration of Independence. So, he originally got Jefferson's name wrong. He clearly clarified this. And that's the first published reference. And you don't see many references to Jefferson as author until, as Todd points out, really the election of 1796, when Jefferson and Adams are now, being put forth as candidates for the presidency in opposition to one another. And one of the charges that the Federalists are levying against Thomas Jefferson is that he's really un-American. Jefferson has spent time in France. The Federalists have done everything they can, and with a few able assists by Thomas Jefferson himself, to link him with the French Revolution. And what better response to this charge that Jefferson is un-American and that he's really more of a French revolutionary than an American revolutionary than for the Jeffersonian Republicans to say, oh yeah, he wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Wow. Well, I am afraid this is lots of fun. I am afraid we are out of time. I want to thank both of our panelists, Rob and Todd, as well as our participants for some terrific questions. Just a reminder about the email you'll be receiving with a link for a certificate of participation if you would like that. If you have enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashbrook Center, which are also offered as part of our MAG program. Rob and Todd are both instructors in that program, of course. You can find more information about Ashbrook's online course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org, and you can help us spread the word about these programs by sharing the archive link, which you'll receive by email next week. Share that with your colleagues and on social media. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will be Wednesday, September 20th, when our subject will be James Madison's Federalist 51. At that time, I'll be joined by Dr. Jeremy Bailey of the University of Houston and Dr. Adam Seagrave of the University of Missouri. The recommended readings for that webinar have already been posted, so check them out. We hope to see you back here on September 20th. Have a terrific evening, everyone.